Can you hear that? Yeah. Okay. It's always hard to know. Ursus, why don't you move over there where I can see you?
Oh, thanks.
Hey, Ben.
Hello, Mr. Bob. How are you today?
Doing well.
Good.
I think we'll start here. There's not a whole lot of noise out there today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. How are you? I'm fine. I'm fine. Enjoyed your lesson this week. It was very interesting. Just trying to keep up was kind of a problem, you know, when you get older.
Okay, order in the court. I'm going to call on Jimmy to lead our prayer.
Father in heaven, we thank you again for another day. Thank you especially for this Lord's Day and great events that it brings to mind and that we participate in through our worship, through our participation in the Lord's Supper, through our assembly. We pray you would bless us in our time together today, be with us and among us. May we honor you and praise you, and may we build up one another. And bless Bobby during this time of Bible study today. We pray through Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Okay, I'm going to try to figure out how far away to stand from this microphone. Is this okay? Okay. We talked about Romans 12 last week, and we got about 2/3 of the way through it. The rest of Romans 12 is a series of proverbs, something like that, that you can read through, but we're going to skip on over to Romans 13. This is a coin. It's a shilling that was minted in 1955. Queen Elizabeth became queen. She was born in 1926, and she became queen in 1952. And so she had been queen for 3 years, and I think she was about 29 at the time that this coin was minted. And you'll see some letters on it. I talked about this with my grandsons. Lynette and the boys go through coins all the time, and they like to collect coins. And so you'll see some abbreviations on here. On the right, where her picture is, it says, at the bottom, it says DEI Gratia. That's from about 5 o'clock to about 8 o'clock. And what that means is by the grace of God. And then Regina, which means queen. So it says Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, queen. And then over on the left, you see the other side of that coin. And it says 1 shilling at the bottom, and it says FIDDE. And so what that means is defender of the faith. And so she is queen by the grace of God and defender of the faith. And so just very briefly, I want to talk about the concept of the divine right of kings. Now, back at the time of the Mesopotamian kings and the Egyptian pharaohs, the monarch, the king, was considered to be a god and an intermediary between the gods and human beings. And so there was an idea that kings were gods, say 2500 BC. And then and then in the Old Testament, we know that the king was not considered to be a god, right? But what did David say when he was tempted to kill Saul? What did he say? That's right. He said that he could not lay his hand on the Lord's anointed. And so even though David was not, Saul was not considered to be a god, nevertheless, David recognized the anointment of Saul by Samuel as an appointment by God of Saul. And so even though Saul became a bad person, nevertheless, David would not lay his hands on him because God had anointed him king. Now, when Rome became a republic in about the 8th century BC, the legend is that Romulus and Remus were raised by the she-wolf, and so when you see the symbol of Rome, there is a wolf and 2 little boys nursing under, and those are Romulus and Remus. And Romulus was the first king of Rome, and he was considered to be a god. But the Roman emperors and the kings before became gods, became deified only after they died. And so the first emperor was Augustus, but Julius Caesar, who sort of led into that, he adopted Augustus as his son. He was deified by order of the Senate after his death. And so Augustus and Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, and Titus were all deified after their deaths. And so the concept of the emperor as a god was important later on. Now, of course, Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome in the 4th century in about 330 or something like that. And so he adopted Christianity, and so the things that we study today entered into the decision-making about the king when Christianity became the official religion of Rome. So what we're going to study today came into the ideas related to the untouchability of the king. And then as time went by, an event took place, or events took place Muhammad was born in 532 and died, 570 and died in 632. And after Muhammad died, within 100 years, the Muslim conquest had reached up into France, and they had come around the other way and besieged Constantinople 2 times. And so the Pope decided that he needed to have protection for the papacy and the center of the church. And so they created a union between the political military arm and the church, the papacy. And so in AD 800, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne became the first emperor of what was called the Holy Roman Empire. And so the Holy Roman Empire was a fusion of the papacy and the political ruler. And from that time on, the Pope and the emperor contested with each other who was to be in charge. They fussed back and forth, until the end of the Holy Roman Empire about 1,000 years later. And so there was this contest back and forth. And then in the Middle Ages, as the emperor was considered to be a successor to the Roman emperors, and Christianity brought the ideas that we're about to talk about in just a minute in, the king became more and more untouchable. The kings claimed a divine right that made them superior even to the Pope. And so they said that only God could depose a king, that he could not be deposed by people or even by the Pope. Now, we know that in the 14th century, John Wycliffe and other people started translating the Bible into English. And so people who got the Bible looked at it and were shocked at what they read in the Bible, because it was so much in contrast to what they saw in the church at the time. And so they began to be a series of things led to the break from the Catholic Church of the Church of England. And so Protestantism sort of began during this time of ferment that took place because of the publication of the Bible in English. That was what really started to change people's minds and lead them away from the Catholic Church. Other things were that the papacy moved to France, to Avignon in France, in the 1300s, and the English hated the idea that they were having to send money to a French pope, because they were always at war with France over the English lands that were across the English Channel in France. And so this conflict took place. And so then at the time of Henry VIII, after the Church of England broke away, there began to be ideas that led away from the divine right of kings during the time of the Enlightenment. And so the Declaration of Independence that we have rejects the king, but it doesn't do it on a Christian basis. It does it on the basis of a natural law. It recognizes a creator, but the arguments made in our Declaration of Independence are not Christian ideals. They are an appeal to a concept of a natural law. Now, what did Christianity contribute to this idea. Romans 13, and these verses that we have right here are the verses that we're going to talk about today, and sort of go through these. And so if you turn to Romans 13, you'll see that there's a long section, 6 or 7 verses there, that we're pretty familiar with, that have led us to a lot of the ideas that we have regarding obedience to the government. And so let's think first about Matthew 22:17 before we get to Romans 13. Okay, in this instance, the Pharisees came to Jesus along with the Herodians, and they asked him a question. And the Herodians were allied with the political government of Herod. And so the Pharisees came up with a very clever question to ask Jesus. And what was that question? Exactly. Janie always gets it right. And she said, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? That's right. And so as this went through, Jesus asked him for a coin, and he said, hey, there's a picture on this coin. Whose picture is it? And they said, Caesar's. And he said, there's something written on this coin. And so then he said, render therefore, because Caesar's picture's on this coin, he said, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And so that has worked its way into the summation of our thoughts about this. Okay. 1 Timothy 2:1. Okay. He says, first of all, and I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all men, for kings, and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, godly and respectful in every way. And so he's praying. He says, I want you to pray for the kings and all of these people in high positions for a reason. And that reason is so that they will let us live in peace, so that we can lead a quiet and peaceable life, godly and respectful in every way. He's not passing judgment on who the president is or anything like that. He just wants Christians to be able to live and practice Christianity in peace. And so we pray for our rulers that they will not persecute us, that we can live in peace. Okay, that's 1 Timothy 2. So now, John 19:11. This is when Jesus was going back and forth before Pilate. He had an exchange with Pilate. And at one point, Jesus demonstrated a reluctance to defend himself to Pilate. He wouldn't defend himself. And Pilate said, don't you know that I have the power to release you or to crucify you? And Jesus said, he said, you wouldn't have any power at all unless it had been given to you. And so he said, God has permitted you to say such a thing to me, but he who delivered me to you has the greater blame. And so he said, even Pilate was not as guilty in what was going on as the people who delivered him to Pilate were. And so he said the greater blame from this situation rests on the Jewish authorities who delivered Jesus to Pilate, and less on Pilate. But one thing he said was that the power that Pilate had had been delivered to him essentially by God. And so this also entered into the thinking and enters into our thinking, because it's just another data point in our decision making about our relation to the government. Now, I've been talking to my daughter, Karina, my older daughter, because she's going to teach a class that deals with the question about, I guess, maybe civil disobedience and the degree to which you vocalize your complaints to the government. One that I don't have down here, it's in Matthew 12. And in this story, in Matthew 12, Jesus healed a man with a withered hand. And when he was criticized about this, he said, "What man of you, if he had one sheep and it fell into a pit on the Sabbath, would not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep?" And after this took place, a lot of people followed Jesus, and the authorities made it a point to destroy him, and said Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there. And then it it quoted an Old Testament passage that said, he will not raise his voice in the streets. And so what it said was that Jesus withdrew from there. Rather than engage in a conflict with the Pharisees, he withdrew, and he would not raise his voice in the streets. So that is an interesting question. For example, if you have an evil, an atrocity like abortion being carried out, should Christians pick up a sign and write something on it? Should they chant slogans and walk through the streets doing this? Should they do that or not? All right, Aristus.
I want to make kind of an observational point on it. I think some of it would be in that situation with Christ not raising his voice in the middle. I don't know if it is only a matter of if it is right or wrong, but also wisdom, because maybe the people at that point were getting pretty hot on the subject, and he didn't necessarily want to revolt behind it, because that wasn't, I'm guessing, Jesus' way. So some of it might be, whether it's right or wrong, some of it is also
Some of it is strategic.
right, strategic and wisdom, and because he wasn't there to destroy the physical empire to take over that people were expecting him to.
Right. When we have our complaints about our children, we have to pick our fights, right? And so I understand exactly what you're saying. What he suggested was that Jesus' decision not to raise his, it says, he will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. His decision not to wrangle or cry aloud, nor to have his voice heard in the streets, might have been a strategic decision in order to avoid an escalation of the conflict. Right. Okay. That's a good point, I think. Okay. Titus 3:1. This is just a verse that says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work. And so this is Paul writing to Titus. Titus was in Crete. This is why I left you in Crete, right? And so Titus was in Crete, and Paul says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities. Another verse that suggests that you should be submissive to the government. Okay, 1 Peter 2, verse 13. Let's turn to 1 Peter 2, verse 13, and let me get Karen to read a few verses there, okay? Yeah, read it loudly now, Karen.
Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as free, or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king.
Okay. All right, and so he says that emperors, governors in particular, should be honored and obeyed. And in fact, he says, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor, or honor the king. And so this would have been, he would have written this during the time of Nero, who was a bad emperor, a bad king. And when we talk about things that are said in Romans and 1 Peter, these are the two main passages. We're talking about submission to a person who surely is worse than English kings. Maybe not, but surely was what we would consider an immoral ruler, right, Karen?
I think it's really powerful if it says, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice.
Right.
I don't really, when I just read that, makes me just, that's applicable today, to any time, but to think about that, not using liberty as a cloak for vice. Wow.
Yeah. He said, live as free men, yet not using your freedom as a cloak for evil. And so what she pointed out was that that living in freedom does not imply, I guess, vice, right? And it's not a permission to engage in something that you shouldn't. Aristus.
I also think a very good example of somebody living, like honoring the government or whatever, is also the whole story of Daniel.
Daniel, okay.
He went through multiple people, and kind of like it says here, so people cannot really say anything about you, because it's very easy for us to say, I don't believe that this president or this king or whatever are holy, so I'll do whatever I want, because they're not with God anyway, and I ain't with them, which is also kind of saying, using the freedom as vice. I think Daniel was such a good example of that, that there are times that he would say, no, I'm going to do what God is asking me, but at the same time, he was very trusted, and he was very honored among kings in exile.
Right. When Daniel and his three friends were brought back, they were cultivated to be to bring new ideas and to become advisors of the king at the time. And so, as Aristus said, he was trusted, and he played an advisory role. And yet, when the time came for him to choose God rather than the king, that's just exactly what he did. Right, that's the example of Daniel. So anyway, 1 Peter 2 also suggests that be submissive to rulers and authorities, as it says in Titus, to the emperor supreme or to governors as sent by him to what? To punish those who do evil and to praise those who do right. So that's what the ruler is there to do, to punish and to praise, to reward good citizenship and to punish bad citizenship. Now, we know that kings don't always do that. Sometimes they praise bad citizenship and punish good citizenship, right? And so they're not consistent. But anyway, we're supposed to respect them and live in compliance with our laws. Excuse me. Okay, any more comments about 1 Peter 2? All right, let's go to Romans 13 then. Okay, it says, and this is just out of the blue, that is, there's no continuity between this passage and what was said in the previous passage. And it's going to go on to something else after this. And so these are a series of somewhat disconnected ideas, but there are things that Paul, it seems, felt it important to say. Now, it may be that, at this time of Nero, that Christians were persecuted. Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome, right? And that's how Aquila and Priscilla were kicked out of Rome with the Jews at the time. And so these Roman emperors were persecuting Christians, but Christians were also becoming somewhat stronger, and they made inroads into the upper echelons of society. But anyway, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And so what did Henry VIII say? For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So Henry VIII said, Romans 13 says that I've been appointed by God, and even the Pope can't dethrone me, even though he might excommunicate me. And eventually, of course, he went on to split from the Catholic Church, to establish a new church, and to give himself the right to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so that is, the king was political and religious ruler. And that's why on that coin it says, defender of the faith. That's what the king was. That's what Queen Elizabeth was at the age of 29. She was a defender of the faith, and she was queen by the grace of God. All right, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And now, therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Well, now we start getting into ideas like capital punishment. We start getting into ideas like what was discussed when I was a young boy, carnal warfare. And so, what is carnal warfare? It's getting into the military and going to fight somebody under the authority of the government. And so the church, ever since its inception, and I think of the inception of the church as about 1800, ever since, and the right of the government to execute somebody. Now, why does the right to execute somebody come into this discussion? Because of what it says next, right? Okay. And so and those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a deterrent to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who's in authority? Then do right, and you will receive his approval. But if you do wrong, what then? Be afraid. And why should you be afraid? Because he's going to put you in stocks? Because he's going to whip you? Because he does not bear the sword in vain. And the sword is used for only one thing. And what is the sword used for? To kill people, right? You don't use a sword for anything but to kill people. You don't whip people with it. You know, you don't just shake it at them. You kill people with it. And so this verse has given rise to the discussion about the rightness or wrongness of capital punishment. And so I'm not taking a stand one way or the other, but this verse does say he does not bear the sword in vain. Now, when he bears the sword, under whose authority does he bear the sword? He's the minister of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. So this is what Romans 13, these are the words of Romans 13 that are, of all of these verses, are the most action-packed. They're the most piercing of all of the verses that we've had because they're so vivid in their description of what the king is supposed to do or what might be his rights. He does not bear the sword in vain. He is the minister of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. And so, therefore, one must be not only for the sake of conscience, but also to avoid the wrath of God. So, one must be subject. The citizen must be subject not only for the sake of conscience, but to avoid the wrath of God. And how is the wrath of God delivered to the citizen? Through the sword of the authority. And so we're supposed to, our consciences are supposed to direct us to be lawful citizens. When I was a child, we had a little grocery store down the street, and there was a Hershey bar that had gotten knocked down by some other child and flipped under the counter there or something. And I sneaked that Hershey bar out and took it home. And my parents saw the Hershey bar, and, you know, children think that they just have no idea what their parents see and know. And so I had to take the Hershey bar back to the store and to apologize to the store owner for having taken it. And so I sort of had an excuse. Well, it wasn't on the rack, it was on the floor. But you are subject for the sake of conscience. When you are tempted to do something wrong, your conscience should make you subject to that, but also to avoid the wrath of God. So, anyway, these are all interesting verses that give us data points about how to interpret a lot of different ideas. The main thrust of these verses should make us subject to the government and to make us good citizens. That's why they're put there. They're not put there to give the government the ability to execute people. They're not even spoken to the government. They're spoken to the Christian, and their thrust is to make the Christian a good citizen, even if he doesn't like the government. Any comments about that? Jordan? Jimmy? Jordan?
Well, I was just thinking, a lot of this was written where authorities were appointed or anointed, as we talked about. And we live in a participatory government where we elect our officials. So like this was spoken to the populace, like a narrow section of the populace. And so how do you square that where the main vehicle for our government is the populace participating in?
Of the people, by the people, for the people, right. Yeah, and there are some people who feel that you should not even vote. And so, do you have a point to make about that?
No, I mean, no point, just a difficult thought, because a lot of our comments were brought up earlier in class about should we as Christians protest?
Right.
Or picket, or, run for office, voice our opinions in the street,
Yeah, and also, if you are acting under the auspices of the government, can you take a gun and kill somebody with it, right?
Yeah, because you're wielding the sword on the Lord's behalf.
That's right. The Lord, through the emperor or the king, through you. If someone is going to be executed, could you flip the switch, right? Under the authority of the government. Do you want, Janie?
I think sometimes we, especially in the United States, we criticize the government and we don't realize or think about what a good thing it is to live in an orderly society.
Right.
One of the most terrifying verses in the Bible to me is at the end of Judges when it says, there was no king in the land and every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Uh-huh.
That is anarchy.
Right.
And we don't have to live that way.
Yeah, she cited a great verse. It said, there was no king in the land, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And it is true. I've told my son-in-law, who is, I don't know, anyway, that if the government ever disappeared, that would be the last good night's sleep that he ever had, because there would be no order. And without the king, there is no order. I think that's a good point, and we'll end on that. Okay, thank you.